What if the missile was already in the air before you knew it had been fired? What if somewhere above your city, right now, a battle was being fought that you could not see, could not hear, and could not stop with any weapon that had ever existed before? What if the difference between a city block reduced to rubble and a family sitting down to dinner was not a soldier, not a wall, not a bunker, but a piece of software, a fraction of a second, and a calculation so precise that it could predict where a projectile fired in anger would be in 4 seconds and send another projectile to meet it midair? This is not science fiction. This is not a military fantasy dreamed up in a war room in Washington or Moscow. This is a system that exists, that works, that has intercepted thousands of rockets fired at civilian neighborhoods, and that was built, not by a superpower with unlimited resources and decades of research, but by a relatively small nation, under existential pressure, in less than 4 years. The Iron Dome, 3 words that have become synonymous with modern aerial defense, with the ingenuity of Israeli engineering, and with one of the most consequential military development programs of the 21st century. 3 words that sound simple, that look impressive on a news broadcast when you see the trails of light streaking across a night sky over Tel Aviv or Ashkelon or Sderot. But behind those 3 words is a story that almost no one has told in full. Before we go any further, if you are watching this and you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this is the moment. Leave a comment below and tell us which military technology story you want us to cover next, because what you are about to hear is not just the story of a weapon system. It is the story of engineers working through the night under rocket fire, of a government that was told it could not be done, of a retired general who refused to accept that answer, of workers on an assembly line who understood that the component they were fastening might one day be the reason a child in a southern Israeli town survived the night. This is not a story about geopolitics at the abstract level of think tanks and foreign policy journals. This is a story about a specific kind of human desperation, the desperation of a population that has accepted, as a feature of daily life, the sound of a siren that gives you 15 seconds to reach shelter before something built to kill you falls from the sky. And it is the story of what happens when a group of extraordinarily talented engineers decide that 15 seconds is not an acceptable answer, that there must be another answer, that they will build it themselves. This is the story of how $3 billion, a handful of brilliant engineers, one catastrophic war, and an almost impossible deadline produced a system that changed the rules of modern conflict forever. A system that is operating, intercepting, calculating, and deciding right now, as you watch this, over cities that have come to depend on it the way other cities depend on hospitals and fire stations. A system that has saved thousands of lives, and that carries, within its remarkable design, some of the most profound and uncomfortable questions that military technology can raise. But to understand what the Iron Dome is, you first have to understand what it was built to answer. You have to go back to a summer that scarred an entire nation. A summer when the skies over northern Israel filled with something that no technology in the world could reliably stop. A summer when the old certainties of military power were exposed as completely, terrifyingly inadequate. Let's dive in. To understand why the Iron Dome had to exist, you have to stand in northern Israel in the summer of 2006 and feel what it felt like to be completely helpless. Picture the Galilee, rolling green hills in the north of Israel, ancient towns built on slopes overlooking valleys that have seen armies pass through them since before the Bible was written. Haifa, a port city of nearly 300,000 people, with a harbor that has welcomed ships for 2,000 years, a university on the ridge of Mount Carmel, a mixed population of Jews and Arabs who had built a degree of coexistence that the rest of the region envied. Nahariya, Kiryat Shmona, safe, smaller cities and towns dotting a landscape of remarkable beauty. This was a region that had known conflict, had lived alongside it for decades, had built shelters into the basements of apartment buildings and schools as a matter of routine. But nothing that had come before prepared them for what arrived in July 2006. On July 12th of that year, Hezbollah launched a cross-border raid into Israel, killing 8 soldiers and capturing 2. The Israeli government responded with a military campaign that would last 34 days. What was supposed to be a swift, decisive operation became something far more complicated. And what Hezbollah launched in response to the Israeli offensive exposed a vulnerability that the Israeli military and political establishment had not fully grasped until it was too late. Rockets. Not the sophisticated ballistic missiles of major state militaries, not precision-guided weapons with warheads designed to destroy specific targets. Simple, crude, unguided rockets, Katyushas, mostly, a Soviet-era design that had been manufactured by the millions and spread across the Middle East like seeds scattered in a storm. A Katyusha is not a sophisticated weapon. It has no guidance system. It cannot be aimed with precision. You point the launcher in a general direction, calculate the rough distance to your target, set the angle of the launch rail, and fire. Where it lands is as much a matter of chance as of intent. And yet, in the summer of 2006, Hezbollah fired approximately 4,000 of them into northern Israel, 4,000 rockets in 34 days. That is roughly 118 rockets per day, 5 rockets every hour for more than a month. They fell on Haifa, they fell on Kiryat Shmona, they fell on Nahariya. They fell on kibbutzim and Arab villages and highways and hospitals and schools. 44 Israeli civilians were killed, hundreds more were wounded, but the physical casualties, terrible as they were not the most devastating consequence of those 4,000 rockets. The most devastating consequence was the paralysis. 1 million people in northern Israel, 1 million, either fled their homes or spent those 34 days living in bomb shelters. The entire economic life of a region ground to a halt. Schools were closed, businesses shuttered, highways emptied. The psychological toll was incalculable. A generation of children in Kiryat Shmona grew up knowing that when the siren sounded, you had somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds to reach a shelter before the rocket landed. That is not a number. That is a childhood defined by the sound of an air raid siren. Beyond the numbers, there is something important to understand about what those rockets did to the social fabric of the North. The Israeli concept of resilience, a kind of gritty ability to absorb punishment and keep functioning, was being tested in ways that revealed its real limits. Kindergarten teachers in Haifa were trained to respond to sirens. Entire lesson plans were restructured around shelter drills. Parents in Kiryat Shmona were sending their children to relatives in the center of the country, in cities that were out of Katyusha range. Those who could not or would not leave were making daily calculations that no civilian population should have to make. There is a woman, her story is representative of thousands, who lived with her 3 children in an apartment building in Nahariya during the summer of 2006. Her husband was on reserve duty with the military. She had no car. The sirens that summer sounded sometimes 3 and 4 times in a single hour during the worst days. She and her children ran to the building's shelter, a room in the basement that had been built during an earlier era of conflict, and that smelled of damp concrete and old paint. They ate meals there. The children did their homework there when they could concentrate. They slept there on nights when the sirens came after midnight. By the time the ceasefire came in August, her youngest child had not left the building in 11 days. Multiply that story by 1 million, and you begin to understand the political earthquake that the 2006 war produced in Israel. And what could the Israeli military do about it? The honest answer in the summer of 2006 was very little. The Israeli Air Force flew thousands of sorties over southern Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah launch sites, and still the rockets came. Because a Katyusha launcher is not a complex installation. It is a truck, or a modified car, or a platform hidden in a valley or behind a building. You can fire it in minutes and drive away in seconds. Finding and destroying every launcher was, in practice, impossible. Israel had missile defense systems. It had the Arrow, a sophisticated long-range interceptor designed to destroy ballistic missiles at high altitude. But the Arrow was built to fight the large, slow-moving ballistic missiles of state adversaries like Syria or Iran. It was like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. Those Katyushas, flying low, fast, at short range, were exactly the kind of threat the Arrow was never designed to address. There was, quite literally, no system in the world that could reliably intercept short-range unguided rockets in 2006. Not in Israel, not in the United States, not anywhere. The war ended on August 14th with a United Nations ceasefire. Israel had not achieved its stated military objectives. Hezbollah remained intact, claiming a propaganda victory. The Israeli public was shaken. The then Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Dan Halutz, resigned in January 2007. The Winograd Commission, a government inquiry into the conduct of the war, issued reports that were scathing in their assessment of leadership failures. Prime Minister Olmert never fully recovered his political standing, and in the defense establishments of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, a question was being asked with a new and urgent intensity: what do we do about the rockets? The geography of the conflict matters as much as the politics. Northern Israel is not a vast country with room to absorb punishment. From the Lebanese border to the outskirts of Haifa is roughly 40 kilometers. From the Gaza border to the center of Ashkelon is less than 12 kilometers. From Sderot, a working-class Israeli city that became one of the most rocket-targeted communities on Earth, to the Gaza perimeter fence is less than 2 kilometers. These are not distances, they are seconds. A rocket fired from near the Gaza border fence reaches Sderot before the fastest human being alive could run to the end of their street. In this geography, the traditional military calculus of territory and depth means almost nothing. Israel cannot trade space for time the way a larger country might. When your enemy is a few hundred meters away, there is no space to trade. The historical weight of this geography adds another layer. The communities of the Gaza envelope, the ring of Israeli towns and kibbutzim surrounding Gaza, were built by people who chose to live on a contested frontier. Many of them were founded in the years after Israel's establishment, populated by idealistic settlers who believed that building communities, farming the land, and planting trees was itself an act of national affirmation. The kibbutzim of the Northwest, Negev, Be'eri, Nahal Oz, Kfar Aza, Nur Oz, were among the most committed expressions of an idealistic vision of collective life. They were also, by the brutal arithmetic of geography, among the most vulnerable communities in the country. For years before 2006, they had absorbed Qassam rocket fire from Gaza with a stoicism that the rest of Israel sometimes found incomprehensible. They had built safe rooms, they had taught their children to run, they had done what they could, and what they had asked the government repeatedly was the question that Daniel Gold would eventually try to answer. Is there not something more that can be done? The answer would take the form of a system that had never been built before, and the man who decided it was possible was not a scientist or an engineer. He was a general who had spent years preparing for exactly this problem. Brigadier General Daniel Gold was not the kind of man who accepted that a problem had no solution simply because no one had solved it yet. In the years before 2006, Gold had served in various capacities within the Israeli Defense Ministry's research and development establishment. He understood technology, he understood military requirements, and he understood, perhaps better than most, that Israel's strategic situation, a small country surrounded by adversaries, with no territorial depth to speak of, with civilian population centers only kilometers from hostile borders, meant that the old equations of military power did not fully apply. Israel could not afford to absorb punishment the way a larger nation might. Every rocket that landed in a city was not just a military problem. It was a political one, a psychological one, an existential challenge to the idea that the state could protect its citizens. When the 2006 Lebanon War ended, Gold was head of the Directorate for Defense Research and Development, known in Hebrew by its acronym MAFAT. He had, in the years before the war, been thinking about the problem of short-range rocket defense with an urgency that his colleagues sometimes found excessive. He had been watching the accumulation of rockets in Hezbollah's arsenal with growing alarm. He had been asking quietly in meetings in position papers whether it was technically feasible to intercept a Katyusha-class rocket, and he had received from various experts and institutions the polite but firm answer that no, it was not. The flight time was too short, the rocket was too small, the cost of an interceptor would be too high relative to the cost of the rocket it was destroying, the physics were against it. Gold's counterargument was moral as much as it was strategic. The offensive approach had been tried in 2006. It had not prevented 4,000 rockets from falling on Israeli cities. The only way to protect civilians in the short and medium term was to intercept the rockets after they were fired, and the cost argument, he maintained, was incomplete. What was the cost of 1 million civilians living in shelters for 34 days? What was the cost to the economy of the north of Israel? What was the political cost of a government that could not protect its people? When you added those numbers up, the economics of interception looked very different. Gold's insistence on the project's feasibility was grounded in a specific technical argument that he and his team had been developing carefully. The key insight was that the problem of intercepting a short-range rocket, while genuinely difficult, was not as intractable as conventional wisdom held, provided you approached it correctly. The conventional approach to missile defense, exemplified by systems like Patriot and Arrow, was designed around ballistic missiles, high-altitude, high-speed, large targets following predictable trajectories. The technical challenge for those systems was speed and altitude. A Katyusha, by contrast, moved relatively slowly, at low altitude, over a short distance. Its flight time was measured in tens of seconds. Its radar cross-section was small but manageable with the right radar design, and because it was unguided, its trajectory was essentially determined by physics from the moment of launch. You did not need to predict what the rocket's pilot was going to do because there was no pilot. You needed only to measure the rocket's initial trajectory and calculate the rest. Gold's argument was that if you designed a system specifically for this threat, rather than adapting an existing system built for a different threat, the problem became tractable. Not easy, not cheap, but tractable. The radar needed to be designed specifically for low-altitude, small cross-section detection. The interceptor needed to be built for short-range, high maneuverability engagement. And the battle management software needed to be constructed from the ground up around the specific mathematical challenge of predicting short-range rocket trajectories and allocating interceptors efficiently. This insight that you had to design for the specific threat rather than adapting a general solution seems obvious in retrospect. But in the institutional context of 2007, where existing systems and existing contractors had enormous bureaucratic investments in existing approaches, it required fighting against significant inertia to pursue. The formal contract between the Israeli Ministry of Defense and Rafael Advanced Defense Systems was signed in early 2007. The financial architecture was assembled over the following months, with the United States Congress appropriating the first tranche of what would eventually become over $2 billion of American co-investment in the program. Senators and representatives from both parties supported the funding, reflecting the broad bipartisan consensus in Washington around the U.S.-Israel security relationship. This was not simply an act of alliance obligation. American defense officials recognized that the Iron Dome represented a breakthrough in short-range rocket defense, with applications well beyond Israel's borders. They were watching with intense professional interest. The political battle to get the program funded was, in its own way, as difficult as the engineering challenge. The political battle to get the program funded was, in its own way, as difficult as the engineering challenge. The Israeli defense budget is not unlimited. Every shekel spent on the Iron Dome was a shekel not spent on offensive capabilities, on intelligence, on other defense programs. There were generals who believed that the money would be better invested in the kind of precision-guided munitions that could destroy rocket launchers before they fired, rather than in a defensive system that would always be, by definition, reactive. There were economists who ran the numbers on cost per interception and arrived at conclusions that seemed to argue against the investment. There were procurement officials who raised legitimate questions about whether the aggressive timeline was achievable and whether committing to it would ultimately result in a system that was rushed to deployment before it was truly ready. Gold navigated these objections with a combination of technical argument, moral argument, and what can only be described as bureaucratic determination. He kept returning to the same central point. The offensive alternative had been tried. The 2006 war had demonstrated, conclusively, that you could fly hundreds of sorties and still not stop the rockets. The only path to protecting civilian lives was to intercept the rockets after they were launched. The question was not whether to build the system. The question was whether to build it now, while the wound of 2006 was still fresh and the political will was present, or to wait and discover in the next war that you still had nothing. The argument worked, the funding was secured, the political support, both in Israel and in the United States, was assembled, and a program that almost didn't happen, that almost fell victim to the institutional skepticism that greets any unprecedented engineering proposal, was launched. What made the difference? Looking back, those who were involved in those early battles point to several factors. The freshness of 2006, the specific and visceral understanding, shared by everyone in those meetings, of what it felt like to have 1 million civilians in shelters for 34 days. The moral clarity that came from the simplicity of the question: if you can build something that will stop these rockets from killing people, do you have a choice not to build it? And the presence at the critical moment of a man in Brigadier General Gold, who combined technical credibility with moral conviction and bureaucratic skill in exactly the right proportions. The deadline they were given was aggressive to the point of being, in the view of many in the industry, unrealistic. Roughly 3 to 4 years from concept to a deployable operational system. For a weapons program of this complexity, that timeline was almost without precedent, and so the engineers went to work. Section 4, The Rise and the Golden Age, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, sits on a campus in the hills above Haifa Bay, a facility that looks from the outside like many corporate research parks. Low buildings, security fences, parking lots full of cars belonging to people who arrive early and leave late. But what happens inside those buildings is not like what happens in most corporate parks anywhere in the world. Rafael was not a startup. It had been founded in 1948, the same year as the State of Israel itself, created out of the urgent necessity of a new nation that needed weapons and had no established defense industry to produce them. Over the subsequent decades, it had grown into one of the most sophisticated defense companies in the world, producing systems ranging from air-to-air missiles to naval defense platforms to smart munitions. The people who worked there were, by any measure, among the best defense engineers on the planet. They were also, many of them, people who had grown up in northern Israel, who had relatives in Haifa and Kiryat Shmona, who had watched the rockets fall in 2006 with the specific rage of those who have both the knowledge and the professional tools to understand what is happening and why it should not be. The Iron Dome program that Raphael took on in 2007 was divided into three core components. The first was the detection and tracking radar. The second was the battle management and control system. And the third, the component most visible to the world, was the interceptor missile, designated Tamir. The radar system was developed in partnership with Elta Systems, a subsidiary of Israel Aerospace Industries. What Elta built was not an ordinary radar. Standard air defense radars are designed to track large, fast-moving objects at long ranges. They are not optimized to detect something the size of a fence post, moving at subsonic speed at a range of a few kilometers, in an environment that also contains birds, cars, buildings, and other objects that produce radar returns. Building a radar that could reliably detect a Katyusha rocket within seconds of launch, track it through its brief flight, and feed that tracking data to a fire control system with enough accuracy to enable an interception was, in the words of one Israeli defense analyst, like trying to find a specific leaf in a forest while the forest is blowing in a storm. The battle management and control system was in many ways the most conceptually innovative part of the entire program. It was not enough to detect a rocket and fire an interceptor at it. The system had to be smart. It had to look at the incoming rocket's trajectory and calculate, in real time, where the rocket was going to land. And then it had to decide. If the calculated impact point was an open field, a body of water, an unpopulated area, the system would not fire. Every interceptor costs money. The supply is finite. Expending a Tamir missile on a rocket that will land harmlessly is a waste of a resource that might be needed a second later for a rocket aimed at an apartment building. This decision-making algorithm, the logic that determines which incoming rockets represent genuine threats and which do not, was one of the most challenging software problems the program faced. It required an extraordinarily accurate model of the terrain, the population density, the location of critical infrastructure, wind conditions, and a dozen other variables. And it had to run fast, not fast by human standards. Fast by the standards of a rocket that covers kilometers in seconds. The software team that built this system worked in conditions that would be familiar to anyone who has experienced an intense technology startup, with one critical difference. The pressure of a startup is fundamentally financial and reputational. The pressure of this team was something more immediate. They had lived through 2006. They knew people in Ashkelon and Kiryat Shmona. Some of them had nephews and nieces who had spent the summer in shelters. The code they were writing was not an abstraction. It was a shield. The algorithms at the core of the battle management system had to solve several interrelated problems simultaneously. First, given radar observations of an incoming rocket over the first 2 seconds of its flight, calculate the most probable impact point with enough accuracy to make a threat assessment. This involves atmospheric physics, numerical integration of trajectory equations, and statistical modeling of radar measurement uncertainty. Second, given that impact point estimate, assess the probability that the impact will fall within a zone containing human life or critical infrastructure. Third, given the threat assessment, decide whether to fire an interceptor, and if so, with what targeting parameters. This decision must balance the immediate threat against the inventory of available interceptors. You cannot fire all your Tamirs at the first salvo and have nothing left for the second. Then there was the Tamir interceptor itself. The design philosophy behind Tamir was elegant in concept and fiendishly complex in execution. Unlike traditional anti-aircraft missiles, which destroy targets by exploding near them and sending shrapnel outward, the Tamir needed to physically hit or come close enough to a relatively small, unguided rocket to neutralize it before it reached the ground. The guidance system in the Tamir had to take initial targeting data from the radar, guide the missile through the atmosphere at high speed, and make continuous corrections during flight as the interceptor homed in on a target that was itself moving. Dr. Yair Ramadi, who served as the Iron Dome project director at Raphael during the development years, later described the challenge in terms that anyone could understand. Imagine, he said, throwing a ball at a tennis ball that someone else has thrown across a field. Now imagine doing it in under 4 seconds. Now imagine doing it reliably, repeatedly, in wind, in rain, at night, with multiple balls coming at you simultaneously from different directions. Now imagine that if you miss, people die. The team worked at a pace that those who were there describe as unlike anything they had experienced before, not because anyone was forcing them to work 60 and 70-hour weeks, though many did, but because the weight of what they were building was something they felt every day. There were evenings when small groups of engineers stood on the terrace outside the cafeteria and looked north toward Lebanon, toward the hills where the 2006 rockets had been fired from, and thought about what they were building and why. Some of them were religious and prayed, some were secular and simply felt the weight of the work. All of them understood that they were doing something that had not been done before and that mattered in the most direct and human way imaginable. Professor Uzi Rubin, who had previously led Israel's ballistic missile defense program and was one of the most respected figures in Israeli missile defense, has described the Iron Dome development period as one of the most remarkable feats of compressed technological development he had ever witnessed. The combination of technical innovation, institutional commitment, and sheer human effort that the program demanded and received was, by his assessment, exceptional. The manufacturing challenge was as formidable as the engineering one. A prototype system built by a team of dedicated researchers under wartime urgency is one thing. A deployable military system that can be produced in sufficient quantities, maintained in the field, operated by soldiers rather than PhD engineers, and sustained through years of operational use is an entirely different order of challenge. Rafael's manufacturing division worked closely with the development teams throughout the program to ensure that design decisions that made engineering sense also made production sense. Components that were technically optimal but difficult to manufacture at scale were revisited. Supply chains for specialized materials were established and tested. Quality control systems appropriate for a safety-critical military weapon were designed and implemented. The Tamir interceptor alone required hundreds of components, many of them manufactured to tolerances that required specialized industrial processes: the rocket motor, the guidance seeker, the fragmentation warhead, the fusing system. The communication link that allowed the interceptor to receive updated targeting data from the ground radar during flight. Each component had to work reliably in conditions of extreme temperature, vibration, humidity, and electromagnetic interference. Each component had to work the first time, every time, because there was no second chance. The workers on the production line at Rafael, the assemblers, the quality inspectors, the technicians who tested each unit before it left the factory, were doing a job that looked, from the outside, like industrial production. But the people who did it understood what was different about this particular production line. They were making interceptors. Each Tamir that rolled off that line and was boxed and shipped to a battery in the field was going to be pointed at the sky over a city. The care they brought to their work was not just professional. It was the specific kind of care that people bring to work when they understand that the quality of their craftsmanship may one day be measured in whether a specific family in Sderot or Ashkelon or Beersheba is still alive. By late 2010, the first Iron Dome battery was ready for testing. What the engineers and generals saw in those tests made some of them, by their own later accounts, simply stand in silence for a moment, because it worked. Imperfectly at first, with issues to be resolved and improvements to be made, but it worked. The radar detected the incoming rockets. The battle management system assessed the threats. The Tamir missiles launched. And in the sky above the test range in the Negev desert, rockets that had been fired to simulate real-world threats were intercepted, neutralized, and eliminated. The system that everyone had said could not be built had been built. In 4 years, now came the test that no laboratory could replicate. Success in a test range and success in combat are different things. This is a truth that every weapons developer knows, and the Iron Dome carried with it several vulnerabilities and limitations that its creators understood and that would be exposed in the years following deployment. The first and most fundamental was the cost exchange problem that Gold's critics had raised from the beginning. A Tamir interceptor missile, at the time of the Iron Dome's early deployments, cost between $40,000 and $50,000 per unit. A Qassam rocket, the type routinely fired from Gaza by Hamas, cost between $800 and $1,000 to manufacture. This asymmetry is not just an accounting concern. It is a strategic vulnerability of deep significance. If an adversary can force you to fire a $50,000 missile to stop a $1,000 rocket, the adversary has an economic incentive to fire rockets in enormous numbers. They will exhaust your interceptor supply or bankrupt you before you stop them. This concern was not hypothetical. It was a calculation that Hamas military planners explicitly made. The strategy of rocket saturation, firing so many rockets simultaneously that a defense system cannot intercept all of them, became a deliberate component of Hamas's approach to confrontations with Israel. In later conflicts, particularly the 2021 escalation and the catastrophic events of October 2023, this strategy would be tested at scales that revealed real limitations in the Iron Dome's capacity to handle simultaneous mass attacks. The adversarial adaptation was not just strategic, it was technical, and watching it unfold over the years following the Iron Dome's deployment tells you something important about the nature of technological competition in modern warfare. When Hamas first encountered the Iron Dome in 2011 and 2012, their initial response was relatively unsophisticated: fire more rockets. The assumption was that volume alone could saturate the system. But as the interception rate held high across multiple operations, Hamas military engineers began studying the Iron Dome's behavior more carefully. They noted that the system did not fire at rockets aimed at open areas. So they developed tactics designed to confuse the impact prediction algorithm, firing in patterns, at varying trajectories, from multiple locations simultaneously, to create uncertainty about which rockets were threats and which were not. They noted that the system had coverage zones and coverage gaps, so they mapped those gaps and tried to exploit them. They noted that the Tamir missile was not unlimited in supply, so they developed mass-firing tactics specifically intended to exhaust the interceptor inventory. Each of these adaptations required a counter-adaptation from Rafael and from the Israeli military. New radar processing algorithms to handle more complex threat environments, new interceptor allocation logic to handle mass-firing scenarios more efficiently, new battery positioning strategies to close the coverage gaps, new simulation training scenarios to prepare operators for the specific tactical situations adversaries had developed. This iterative cycle, attack, adapt, counteradapt, is not unique to the Iron Dome. It is the fundamental dynamic of all military technology competition, but it has a specific intensity in this context because both the threat and the defense operate at the speed of software. A missile design change takes years to implement in hardware. A software update to a battle management system can be deployed in days. This asymmetry actually favored the defense for a period. Rafael could update the system's software faster than Hamas could redesign its rockets. But it required a sustained commitment to software engineering and operational feedback that was itself a substantial organizational challenge. The drone threat introduced a qualitatively different challenge. Armed drones slower than rockets, flying lower, with smaller radar cross-sections and flight profiles that look quite different from ballistic rockets, required the Iron Dome's radar and battle management system to develop entirely new capabilities. A drone is not a ballistic object. Its trajectory is not determined by physics at the moment of launch. It can maneuver, change altitude, approach from unexpected directions. Detecting it, tracking it, and predicting its behavior required extending the system's capabilities in ways that the original design had not anticipated. The engineers who had built the rocket defense system had to become, in effect, drone defense engineers as well. The second limitation was geographic. An Iron Dome battery covers a certain area. Israel is not a large country, but it is not a small one either, and the cost and logistical burden of deploying enough batteries to provide meaningful protection across the entire country, from the northern border with Lebanon, across the center and the coastal cities, down to the south near Gaza, was enormous. In the early years of deployment, the system was concentrated in the areas of highest immediate threat. Communities in less protected areas remained exposed. The decision of where to position a battery was, inevitably, a decision about whose neighborhood was more protected than whose. That is a political and moral problem, not just a technical one. There was also the question of what happened when Iron Dome succeeded too well at something it was never designed to do. The system's very effectiveness created a risk that military and political analysts began to identify with concern. It made conflict more tolerable for the Israeli civilian population, which reduced the political pressure on the Israeli government to pursue diplomatic solutions to the underlying causes of the rocket fire. When rockets fall and nothing intercepts them, the public demands an end to the conflict. When rockets fall and a system plucks them from the sky, the urgency diminishes. Some analysts called this the normalization of conflict, one of the Iron Dome's most complex unintended consequences. There were technical evolution challenges as well. The threats were not static. As the Iron Dome proved effective against standard Katyusha and Qassam rockets, adversaries began adapting. longer-range rockets, rockets with larger warheads designed to overwhelm or confuse the radar systems. Mortars, a different trajectory, a different flight profile, much harder to intercept. Anti-tank missiles, swarms of armed drones. Each new threat type required the system's software and sometimes its hardware to be updated and adapted. The Iron Dome was not a finished product that could be deployed and forgotten. It was a living system in a constant technological arms race with the people it was designed to defeat. And then there were the broader questions that the international community began asking, particularly around the role of Iron Dome in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Critics, including some within Israel, argued that the defensive shield provided by the Iron Dome allowed successive Israeli governments to manage the conflict rather than resolve it, to accept periodic escalation punctuated by ceasefires without the political cost that would otherwise compel genuine engagement with the structural causes of the violence. These were not technical critiques, they were political and moral ones, and they were not easily dismissed. The Iron Dome was not a perfect solution, its creators never claimed it was. But the pressure it was under, the expectation that a technology could solve a problem that was fundamentally political and human, was, by any reasonable measure, unfair. The date is April 7, 2011, northern Gaza. A launch crew from a Palestinian militant group positions a Grad rocket, a longer-range, more destructive version of the basic Katyusha, points it northeast toward Ashkelon, a coastal city of about 120,000 people, and fires. The rocket is in the air within seconds. Its flight time to Ashkelon is approximately 45 seconds. At the Iron Dome battery positioned to cover the Ashkelon area, the radar has already detected the launch. Within the first few seconds of flight, the battle management system has calculated the trajectory. It has run the impact prediction algorithm. It has assessed the likely landing zone. The calculation confirms that the rocket is heading toward a populated residential area of the city. The authorization is given. A Tamir interceptor missile launches from the battery with a thunderclap that people half a kilometer away will later describe as the loudest sound they have heard outside of a thunderstorm. The Tamir streaks upward at a speed that makes it nearly invisible to the naked eye. Its guidance system is receiving continuous updates from the radar, adjusting its flight path in real time as it converges on the incoming Grad. Approximately 30 seconds after launch, over the skies south of Ashkelon, the Tamir reaches the Grad rocket. The interception is successful. The rocket is destroyed in midair. The explosion produces a brief flash and a small plume of smoke and debris that disperses in the sea breeze coming off the Mediterranean. In the city of Ashkelon, the siren has sounded. People have moved toward shelter. They wait. They hear the explosion above them, and then they wait a few more seconds, and nothing falls, nothing falls. This moment, April 7, 2011, is the first operational interception in the history of the Iron Dome. It proves, in conditions of actual combat rather than a controlled test, that the system works. But the real stress test comes in November 2012, during an 8-day conflict that the Israeli military calls Operation Pillar of Defense. Over those 8 days, Palestinian militant groups fire approximately 1,500 rockets and mortars at Israel. The Iron Dome, now deployed in multiple batteries covering different parts of the country, intercepts approximately 400 of the rockets aimed at populated areas. The Israeli civilian death toll is 5. In the 2006 war, before the Iron Dome existed, a similar intensity of rocket fire had killed 44 civilians in 34 days. The difference in that single comparison is not a statistic. It is 39 human lives. During those 8 days in Tel Aviv, a city of over 400,000 people that had not faced rocket fire since the Iraqi Scud attacks of 1991, air raid sirens sound for the first time in over 2 decades. People in apartments and offices run to stairwells and interior corridors. On the streets of South Tel Aviv, pedestrians look up and see the streaks of Tamir interceptors rising to meet incoming rockets. Some of them take photographs. Some of them stand in silence. None of them, watching those streaks of light, are entirely sure what they are seeing, destruction or salvation. The two have become, visually, indistinguishable. For the military commanders operating the batteries, the 8 days of Pillar of Defense provide an operational education that no training exercise could have replicated. They learn the real-world performance of the radar under operational conditions. They learn how adversaries vary their firing patterns in response to interceptions, increasing the rate of fire, mixing rocket types, sometimes firing in patterns designed to exhaust specific battery coverage zones. They learn the supply chain realities of maintaining interceptor stocks during sustained engagement. Every lesson is fed back to Raphael in real time, and the engineering teams begin incorporating the operational feedback into the next software update within days of the ceasefire. Then, in the summer of 2014, during the 50-day conflict known as Operation Protective Edge, the system faces the largest single test in its history. Hamas and other groups fire approximately 4,700 rockets and mortars at Israel over 50 days. The Iron Dome fires over 700 interceptors. Battery commanders make real-time decisions about threat prioritization that the algorithms assist but do not replace. There are moments of interceptor shortage in specific batteries that require tactical decisions about which threats to engage and which to allow to fall in less densely populated areas. There are technical issues, quickly resolved. There are moments of extraordinary performance, multiple simultaneous intercepts in the same engagement zone, rockets destroyed at the edge of the battery's designed engagement envelope. The civilian death toll on the Israeli side is 6. 6 lives lost in 50 days of the most intensive rocket fire Israel had ever faced from Gaza. The Iron Dome did not save all of them. No system could have. But the military and government assessment, backed by trajectory analysis of the rockets that were not intercepted, was that without the system, the death toll would have been measured in hundreds. The turning point is not a single moment. It is a pattern. It is the accumulation of thousands of interceptions across multiple conflicts, each one representing a calculation run, a decision made, a rocket that did not reach the ground it was aimed at. Each interception is, in the most concrete possible sense, a life that continues, a child who wakes up the next morning, a family that sits down to dinner, a city that carries on. The Iron Dome has changed the calculus of rocket warfare in a way that will take years for the world to fully absorb. Success changes things. That is a truth as old as history, and the Iron Dome's success changed things in ways that were both anticipated and deeply surprising. The most immediate change was in the geopolitical and military calculus of the Middle East. For decades, the threat of rocket fire had been one of the primary instruments of asymmetric warfare available to non-state actors seeking to pressure Israel without triggering a conventional military response. The assumption underlying that strategy was that rockets were essentially unstoppable, that a sufficient quantity of them, fired at civilian areas, would produce casualties and psychological pressure that would eventually translate into political concessions. The Iron Dome significantly degraded the effectiveness of that strategy, and that changed the calculations of every actor in the region. Hezbollah, watching the Iron Dome's performance in Gaza with the full attention of an organization that possessed far more sophisticated rockets than Hamas, began a procurement and development program aimed at overcoming or saturating the system. By the early 2020s, Israeli military intelligence assessments estimated that Hezbollah had accumulated somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 rockets of varying types in southern Lebanon, including precision-guided munitions that the Iron Dome was not designed to intercept, ballistic missiles that fell into the aerosystem's domain, and quantities of rockets large enough that simultaneous mass launches could theoretically overwhelm any currently deployed battery configuration. This was the adversarial adaptation that everyone who understood the system had known was coming. The Iron Dome had bought Israel time and saved lives, but it had not resolved the underlying strategic problem. It had, if anything, accelerated the arms race that surrounds it. Inside Israel, the political aftermath of the Iron Dome's early successes was complex. There was genuine and justified pride in the technological achievement. Israeli politicians across the spectrum pointed to the Iron Dome as evidence of the country's innovative capacity. The system became a source of national identity in a country where military technology has always been deeply intertwined with questions of national survival. For many Israelis, particularly those who lived through 2006 or who have spent years within range of Gaza rockets, the Iron Dome is not a weapons system in any abstract sense. It is the reason their children are alive. But the military and security establishment was simultaneously worried about something that the system's success had created, a public expectation that the Iron Dome could handle anything. The gap between what the system could actually do and what the Israeli public believed it could do was significant. Government officials who tried to communicate the system's real limitations found themselves navigating a political environment in which any acknowledgement of vulnerability was treated as either alarmism or incompetence. This dynamic had real consequences. Investment in civilian shelter infrastructure, which should have been the complementary pillar of any serious civilian protection strategy, was inconsistent and, in many communities, inadequate. In some southern Israeli towns, shelters that dated from the 1970s had not been meaningfully upgraded. The assumption, never stated explicitly but implicitly present in budget decisions, was that the Iron Dome made such investments less urgent. It was an assumption that October 7, 2023, would shatter with devastating force. The Iron Dome program also transformed the global market for missile defense systems. Within a few years of the system's operational success, defense ministries around the world were either seeking to acquire the Iron Dome or to develop comparable systems. The system that had been built in 4 years in the hills above Haifa had become the reference standard for an entirely new category of military capability. The Iron Dome did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a very specific tradition of Israeli military technology development that had been built, layer by layer, across the 7 decades of the state's existence. To understand the depth of those roots, it helps to go back to the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, a conflict that shook Israel's military establishment in ways the country has never entirely recovered from psychologically, even as it recovered strategically. The near catastrophe of 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched simultaneous surprise attacks that initially overwhelmed Israeli defenses, produced a fundamental reassessment of Israeli military doctrine. One of the conclusions was that Israel could not rely solely on offensive military power and deterrence. It needed layers of defense. It needed systems that could protect the home front when deterrence failed. The Arrow anti-ballistic missile program, launched in the late 1980s with American partnership, was the first major fruit of that doctrinal reorientation. The Arrow was designed to intercept long-range ballistic missiles, the kind that Iraq had fired at Israeli cities during the 1991 Gulf War. The Patriot missiles that the United States deployed in Israel during that conflict had performed disappointingly, and the experience confirmed what Israeli defense planners had suspected. The country needed its own solutions, built for its specific threat environment, under its own control. The Arrow program built the institutional infrastructure, the engineering talent, the testing facilities, the government-industry relationships, the funding mechanisms, on which the Iron Dome program would later draw. When Gold launched the Iron Dome initiative in 2007, he was not starting from zero. He was building on 2 decades of accumulated knowledge, experience, and human capital. But the Iron Dome, in turn, has pushed Israeli missile defense into territory that even the Arrow program had not fully explored. The development of David's Sling, a medium-range system designed to fill the gap between the Iron Dome's short-range coverage and the Arrow's long-range domain, drew directly on the lessons and technology of the Iron Dome program. Israel now operates what is, in the assessment of most independent defense analysts, the most comprehensive layered missile defense architecture in the world. Iron Dome at the bottom, covering short-range rockets. David's Sling in the middle, addressing medium-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 at the top, designed to intercept long-range ballistic missiles at high altitude and even in space. This layered architecture has become a model that other nations are studying and, in various forms, attempting to emulate. The United States, which has invested billions of dollars in the various Israeli systems and in its own parallel development programs, has incorporated lessons from the Iron Dome into its ongoing work on integrated air and missile defense, a concept that seeks to provide comprehensive protection for American forces and allies against the full spectrum of aerial threats. The Ukraine war, beginning in 2022, added a new and urgent chapter to this story. Russian cruise missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian cities created a demand for exactly the kind of layered, affordable, quickly deployable air defense that the Iron Dome concept represented. Ukraine sought Iron Dome batteries from Israel, a request that Israel navigated with considerable diplomatic care given its complex relationships with both the United States and Russia. The broader lesson that civilian infrastructure and civilian populations needed defensive systems was one that European NATO members were absorbing with a speed and urgency that would have been unimaginable 5 years earlier. The war in Ukraine revealed something else important, that the proliferation of cheap, mass-produced attack drones was creating a new dimension of the same cost exchange problem that the Iron Dome had always faced. An Iranian-designed Shahd drone, the type Russia deployed by the hundreds against Ukrainian cities, costs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. Intercepting it with a sophisticated missile costs far more. The strategic logic that had shaped Hamas's rocket strategies against the Iron Dome was now being applied on a continental scale in Europe. Every defense ministry in NATO was watching and thinking about what came next. The global implications of what Israel built above Haifa Bay have continued to expand in directions that the original designers of the program could not have fully anticipated. The proliferation of cheap armed drones, a technology that barely existed in militarily significant form when the Iron Dome was being designed, has created a new dimension of the same strategic challenge. A Shahed-136 attack drone, the Iranian design that Russia deployed by the hundreds against Ukrainian cities in 2022 and 2023, costs roughly $20,000 to $50,000. Intercepting it with a conventional missile costs multiples of that. The cost exchange problem that Gold's critics raised in 2007 about Katyusha rockets has reappeared, at larger scale and in a different theater, in the skies over Kyiv and Odessa. Ukraine's air defense struggles have produced intense international interest in Israel's layered defense model, and specifically in the technologies and doctrines that Israel has developed over 2 decades of operational experience. What does Israel know about managing heterogeneous aerial threats, rockets, missiles, drones, mortars, simultaneously, at scale, in real time under political pressure with finite resources? The answer, built through years of operational conflict that no NATO country had experienced, is a great deal. And the sharing of that knowledge, through defense partnerships, technology transfer agreements, joint exercises, and the quiet conversations that happen between military professionals at conferences and in classified briefings, has become one of the more consequential and less publicized forms of Israeli strategic influence in the world. The United States Army's decision to deploy Iron Dome batteries to protect American forces was not taken lightly. The American military has its own robust air defense ecosystem, the Patriot system, THAAD, various shorter-range systems, and adding an Israeli system to that mix required navigating significant institutional and procurement complexity. But the operational requirements were real. American forces in forward-deployed positions in the Middle East and elsewhere faced exactly the kind of short-range rocket and missile threats for which the Iron Dome had been designed. The Army's decision to acquire and operate the system represented both a practical military judgment and a significant signal of confidence in Israel's defense technology sector. For Israel, these international deployments and partnerships are not merely commercial successes, though they are certainly that. They are a form of strategic leverage. A country that provides the technology protecting your soldiers' lives occupies a different relationship with you than a country that merely sells you weapons. The Iron Dome has deepened the U.S.-Israel defense relationship in ways that are structural and durable, not easily unwound by political changes in either capital. That depth of relationship, built component by component and battery by battery, is itself a form of national security. The Iron Dome had begun as Israel's answer to a specific and deadly problem. It had become something larger, a proof of concept for a whole new way of thinking about the defense of civilians, in an era when rockets, missiles, and armed drones had made traditional notions of the protected rear area obsolete. The engineers who built it in 4 years above Haifa Bay had not only built a weapon, they had built an argument, the argument that civilian populations could be defended, that the asymmetric threat of cheap rockets and drones could be countered, that technology, properly conceived and properly funded, could shift the balance between the terror of the sky and the safety of the ground. Whether that argument holds in the long run, against adversaries with ever-growing arsenals and ever-improving tactics, remains to be seen. But the argument has been made. The system exists, it works. And its influence on how the world thinks about civilian defense in the 21st century will be felt long after the specific conflicts that created it have found whatever resolution history grants them. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched an attack on southern Israel that combined a ground invasion, mass killing of civilians, and an unprecedented barrage of rockets. In the initial hours of that morning, Hamas fired approximately 3,000 rockets at Israel in a very short period, a deliberate saturation strategy designed to overwhelm the Iron Dome batteries covering the south by sheer volume of simultaneous launches. The Iron Dome intercepted a significant portion of those rockets, but not all of them. Rockets landed in communities that the system had been protecting for over a decade. The Tamir interceptor supply in the southern batteries was depleted at a rate that required emergency resupply. And the ground invasion, an attack vector that the Iron Dome, a system designed to intercept aerial threats, was not designed to address in any way, killed over 1,200 Israeli civilians and soldiers, and resulted in approximately 250 people being taken as hostages into Gaza. The events of October 7 did not discredit the Iron Dome. They revealed with brutal clarity what the system was and what it was not. It was a remarkably effective tool for intercepting rockets. It was not, and had never been, a comprehensive solution to the security challenges facing Israel. No technology is. The Hamas attack succeeded not because the Iron Dome failed technically, but because the adversary had studied its limitations carefully and built an attack strategy that exploited multiple dimensions of vulnerability simultaneously, overwhelming the aerial defense with saturation while attacking on the ground through points that no missile defense system could address. The lesson is painful but important. Technology can reduce casualties. Technology can buy time. Technology can change the tactical balance in specific domains. What technology cannot do is substitute for the political, diplomatic, and strategic work of addressing the conditions that produce conflict in the first place. For the engineers at Raphael and the policymakers in Jerusalem and Washington who believe in the Iron Dome, October 7th has produced a new urgency around the system's limitations. The saturation problem has moved from a theoretical concern to a demonstrated operational reality. The response has been both technological and logistical. Accelerated production of Tamir interceptors, development of more cost-effective interception technologies, including directed energy systems, high-powered lasers, that could intercept rockets at a fraction of the cost of a Tamir, and improvements to the battle management algorithms that allocate interceptors most efficiently across simultaneous threats. The laser component deserves particular attention. Israel has been developing an iron beam system, a high-powered laser-based interceptor designed to work alongside the Iron Dome, for several years. The appeal is obvious. A laser costs pennies per shot compared to tens of thousands of dollars per Tamir missile. If effective, it would completely transform the cost exchange problem that has always been the Iron Dome's strategic vulnerability. Early tests of the Iron Beam have been described by Israeli officials as promising. Full operational deployment remains a work in progress. Meanwhile, the global market for Iron Dome technology continues to expand. The United States Army has deployed Iron Dome batteries at several military installations. Discussions with multiple other nations are ongoing. The system that was built in 4 years above the hills of Haifa has become one of Israel's most significant strategic exports, not just as a military capability, but as a diplomatic instrument, a symbol of technological partnership, and a demonstration of what the Israel-US defense relationship can produce at its best. There is something almost surreal about the position the Iron Dome occupies in the present moment. It is a system designed to intercept rockets, operating in a conflict whose intensity and nature have evolved far beyond what the original designers envisioned. The adversaries it was built to counter have adapted, expanded their arsenals, and developed strategies specifically aimed at overwhelming or circumventing it. The political context in which it operates has grown more complex, more contested, and more tragic with each cycle of escalation and ceasefire. And yet the system continues to intercept rockets, every day. Somewhere in Israel's threat environment, the radar is scanning, the battle management system is running its calculations, and in some number of cases that the public may not always hear about, a Tamir interceptor is climbing into the sky to meet something that was fired to kill. The engineers who built it are mostly still at Raphael, working on the next generation of the system and on the systems that will complement it. Some of them are now senior figures in the Israeli defense establishment, drawing on what they learned building the Iron Dome to work on challenges that the next decade will bring. Some of them have moved into academia, teaching the next generation of Israeli defense engineers about the principles that made the program work. Some of them have left the defense sector entirely, taking their skills into the civilian technology ecosystem, of which Israel is justifiably proud. But the work they did, the 4 years of compressed brilliance and stubborn engineering and quiet moral seriousness, has not left them. It is part of who they are. They built something that the world said could not be built. They built it for reasons that had nothing to do with profit or prestige, and everything to do with the sound of a siren and the 15 seconds that followed. That is a fact about them that will outlast any system specification and any defense contract. The Iron Dome is operating right now. Somewhere in southern Israel or the center of the country, a battery is powered up, its radar is scanning, and its battle management system is making continuous calculations about the threat environment. Most days those calculations conclude, no threat, the sky is clear, the battery waits. On some days it does not wait. On some days the radar sees something, the algorithm runs, the authorization is given, a Tamir missile launches. And somewhere above a city whose residents may not even realize what just happened, a rocket is intercepted, neutralized, and eliminated. The explosion is brief, the debris disperses, the city continues. That continuity, the unremarkable fact of cities continuing, of children going to school, of families sitting down to dinner, is what the Iron Dome was built to protect. It is unglamorous. It does not make headlines when it works. It only makes headlines when it does not. But the engineers who built it understood that unglamorous continuity, the ordinary, unremarkable persistence of daily life, is exactly what it means to be safe. And they built a system to protect it. And in the communities of southern Israel, Sderot, Ashkelon, Ashdod, the kibbutzim and towns along the Gaza border, the Iron Dome is not a geopolitical concept or a procurement success story. It is the streaks of light across the sky at night. It is the sound of an explosion in the air rather than on the ground. It is, for many of the people who live beneath it, as close to safety as their circumstances have permitted them to reach. No weapon system in the world is viewed the same way by everyone, and the Iron Dome is no exception. The divergence in how it is understood and remembered reveals as much about the politics of those doing the remembering as it does about the system itself. In Israel, the Iron Dome occupies a place in national consciousness that goes beyond its technical specifications. It is a symbol of ingenuity, resilience, and the determination to protect civilian life in conditions where that life is under constant threat. It is held up in classrooms and in political speeches as evidence of what Israeli innovation can achieve. The engineers who built it are, in the culture of the Israeli high-tech and defense sector, figures of genuine admiration. For many Israelis, particularly those who have spent years within range of Gaza rockets, the Iron Dome is not a weapons system in any abstract sense. It is the reason their children are alive. That is not a metaphor. That is a statement of fact that can be defended with trajectory analysis and casualty statistics. In the United States, the Iron Dome is viewed primarily through the lens of the defense partnership with Israel and as a model for American missile defense development. Congressional support for Iron Dome funding has been one of the few genuinely bipartisan positions in American foreign policy across multiple administrations. The system is cited regularly in debates about American defense investment as evidence that missile defense is achievable and that the U.S.-Israel relationship produces tangible security benefits for both parties. American defense officials who have observed the system in operational conditions describe it consistently as one of the most impressive pieces of military engineering they have encountered. The view from Gaza and from much of the Arab world is different. From that perspective, the Iron Dome is not a defensive system protecting civilians. It is a component of Israeli military superiority that enables and emboldens Israeli military operations by reducing the political cost of those operations to Israeli society. If Israeli civilians cannot be meaningfully threatened by rocket fire, the argument goes, then the Israeli government faces less domestic pressure to avoid military confrontations, less incentive to negotiate quickly, less urgency to address the underlying conditions that generate the rockets in the first place. From this perspective, the Iron Dome is not a tool of peace. It is a tool that makes peace less necessary, or at least less urgently necessary. Academic military historians and defense analysts occupy a range of positions between these poles. Some emphasize the genuine technical achievement and the real humanitarian benefit of reduced civilian casualties. Others focus on the strategic and political consequences of effective missile defense, the normalization of manageable conflict, the reduction of urgency around diplomatic resolution, the acceleration of the offensive-defensive arms race. A third group focuses on the methodological questions. How do you accurately measure the Iron Dome's interception rate? How do you evaluate a counterfactual, the lives saved by a system that prevents casualties? What is the right unit of analysis for a system whose effectiveness is measured in events that did not happen? The most nuanced assessments acknowledge all of these dimensions simultaneously. The Iron Dome is a genuine technological achievement. It has saved real lives. It has changed the military and political landscape of the Middle East. It has also contributed to a security dynamic in which both sides of the conflict have adapted to a form of perpetual low-intensity confrontation, periodically escalating and then returning to a fragile equilibrium. What history will make of the Iron Dome depends, ultimately, on whether the conflicts it was built to manage are eventually resolved or merely continued in altered form indefinitely. If at some future point, a durable political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is reached and the rocket fire ends, the Iron Dome may be remembered primarily as the technology that kept enough Israelis alive long enough for that solution to become possible. If the conflict continues for another generation, the Iron Dome will be part of the architecture of its continuation. The debate over how to evaluate and remember the Iron Dome is also a debate about something larger: the role of technology in security and the moral status of defensive versus offensive military capability. There is a long tradition in international law and in the ethics of warfare that treats defensive capabilities as inherently more legitimate than offensive ones. A wall that keeps attackers out is morally simpler than a weapon that kills attackers before they can attack. A shield is, in most ethical frameworks, more acceptable than a sword. The Iron Dome on this analysis occupies the clearest possible moral category. It is a system designed not to kill or destroy, but to prevent things from being killed or destroyed. Its purpose is purely protective. This framing is compelling and, in a narrow technical sense, accurate. The Iron Dome does not attack. It does not kill anyone on purpose. It destroys incoming rockets before they can kill civilians. From a pure logic of weapons standpoint, it is as clean a defensive technology as has ever been built. But critics, and they include thoughtful people who are not simply hostile to Israel, argue that this framing misses the systemic context. A purely defensive analysis of the Iron Dome treats it as if it exists in isolation, as a humanitarian technology floating free of the political environment that surrounds it. But it does not exist in isolation. It exists within a conflict that has specific political causes, specific historical roots, and specific ongoing dynamics. And within that conflict, the Iron Dome plays a role that cannot be fully captured by examining its technical function alone. It changes incentives. It changes political calculations. It changes who bears the cost of continuing the conflict and who is shielded from that cost. Those changes matter morally, even if they are harder to see than the trajectory of a Tamir interceptor. This is not a criticism that the engineers at Rafael can answer. It is a criticism that must be answered, if it can be answered at all, by the political leaders and the diplomats, and ultimately by the populations who live with the consequences of the conflict. But it is a criticism that any honest account of the Iron Dome's legacy has to include, because the most important things about the Iron Dome are not the technical specifications or the interception rates or the cost per shot economics. The most important things are what it means for the people whose lives it protects, what it means for the people whose rockets it destroys, and what it means for the possibility of a future in which neither the rockets nor the interceptors are needed. Both outcomes remain genuinely possible. History has not yet rendered its verdict. The Iron Dome is not the end of the story. It is a chapter, a remarkable, hard-won, technically brilliant chapter in a story that began long before the first Katyusha was ever fired at an Israeli city, and that will continue long after the last Iron Dome battery is eventually decommissioned. What comes next, the laser systems, the network defense architectures, the artificial intelligence that will eventually replace human decision-making in threat assessment, will build on what was built above Haifa Bay between 2007 and 2011. The foundation was laid there. The proof was established there. The belief that civilians could be defended, that the terror of the sky could be answered, that a small nation with brilliant engineers and an existential reason to succeed could do what the rest of the world said was impossible, that belief was proven true there. And that matters not just for Israel, for anyone, anywhere, who has ever looked up at the sky and been afraid of what might come out of it. What does it mean to build something that saves lives but cannot end the conditions that threaten them? The engineers at Rafael who spent years building the Iron Dome did not build it to make war more sustainable. They built it because rockets were falling on children, and they had the knowledge and the skill to try to stop them. That impulse to use what you know to protect the vulnerable is one of the most straightforwardly moral impulses a human being can act on. The system they built has fulfilled its purpose. It has intercepted rockets by the thousands. It has kept people alive who would otherwise have died, and yet the rockets keep coming. The technology has grown more sophisticated. The adversaries have adapted. The political conditions that fill the sky with rockets have not been resolved. The Iron Dome sits at the intersection of humanity's greatest capabilities and its most persistent failures, the ability to engineer solutions to problems that human beings keep refusing to solve through other means. Perhaps that is the question the Iron Dome leaves us with. Not whether the technology works, it does, but whether a civilization that can build a system smart enough to tell a deadly rocket from a harmless one in 4 seconds, from kilometers away, in the dark, in the rain, while 20 other rockets are in the air simultaneously, whether that civilization can also find the wisdom to make the building of such systems eventually unnecessary. That answer cannot be computed. It cannot be intercepted. It has to be chosen. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video and are passionate about this kind of content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos and discover more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.